Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. So engagers, once again, we are back, and this time I think we're in a bit of a rant of, kind of different guests. In a way, we've had quite a few in the past months, more than we did before. I think it's an interesting opportunity to get to see other things going on. And today we have Jennifer, but before we introduce you, Jennifer, are you prepared to engage?
Definitely.
Let's do it, because Jennifer Eberhardt Smith, is that right? Is that well pronounced?
Yes, perfectly.
She is the author of Donuts and Dandelions, Finding Your Joy and Growth. The simple philosophy is focusing on two main life goals helps clarify what you truly want in life. And she is the creator of the arts communication app Paint to Me, which is the culmination of a years-long project. She's now focusing on helping others through their life journey, either as a coach or speaker, both one-on-one and in the professional world. And Donuts and Dandelions is part of her work. It also works sort of in like a game, and that's how we got into contact. But Jennifer, is there anything that I'm missing from that intro, or any quick, thing you want to mention before we dive right into the interview?
Just that I think to connect the two, the book I wrote is basically about doing what's right for you and seeking your own joy. And for me, the app that I created was a result of a project that I had been working on. So it's kind of like, it's a good idea to take your own advice. And so that's what I did. And in taking my own advice, I realized if I commit to this project and really see it through, I could create something really innovative. And that's what I think I did with Paint to Me.
Great. That sounds very, very cool. So, Jennifer, what would you say a regular day for you looks like? Like, what do you do? What does it feel like to be Jennifer on a day like today, yesterday, last week, whatever you want to go through?
So I am a mom, and that takes up a certain portion of my time. Today, wake up, get the kids out of the door to school, spend a lot of time sending off emails and returning emails. That's mostly how people communicate nowadays. And then I invest some time doing things like these. The podcast interviews have been a lot of fun, and it's a way to connect with different people in different parts of the world, and different subject matters come up. So you get to be a little more creative on the fly. And then you kind of take the day back to normalcy, get the kids dinner, get them in bed. And then usually that's when I get to express myself and spend a couple hours working on my own projects, because the house is quiet, and that's always best when you can close the door and just take that time.
Interesting. So the creative projects, and we were talking in the pre-chat about you being in Texas. So very interesting communication here from Madrid to Texas going on.
Yes, very much so. And what's really funny is the person that helped me design the app was actually from Spain. So our communication was usually across different time zones. So we would always email each other while one of us was getting up or going to bed.
Yes, that it usually happens here in Madrid. It's already nighttime. It's dark outside. I'm sure in Texas you're like in the middle of the day right now. Very sunny. So very, very different in that sense.
Definitely.
So Jennifer, can you tell us a story of what you would like to call your favorite failure or first attempt in learning when creating, maybe it was the story of your app or something similar in a creative project, especially because we, as you know, we focus here on the creation of games and gamification. So can you tell a story of a project where you had some initial or partial or final fail, and that we can definitely relate to?
Well, it's applicable to the project itself, because it started out as a painting project. So it was this idea, can I create a language of color? And the creation of the language itself was really fun. And I used real paint, real canvases. The question became, how do I translate that to technology? So that became the big question mark. Are you going to use pictures of the paint samples themselves? Is that going to translate? Will the pixels match? No, they didn't. Okay, so we kind of had to go back to the drawing board on that. So my original idea did not work out at all because I thought I've spent so much time choosing these exact tones, these exact colors, and I have these great pictures of them on the canvas themselves, and you can see the brush strokes. And I thought, wouldn't that be truly unique? But in the execution, it became really problematic. And we tried a couple different things, and it just didn't work because a lot of it depends on how the light hits the paint, how the shadows work. Are the brush strokes bigger or smaller? How do you make it look uniform? It wasn't feasible without delaying the project quite a bit to try to create something that didn't exist, and it just wasn't happening. And so I was initially really disappointed because that was the original vision, and that's the original canvases, and the colors were chosen for a reason. All of the colors are built on associations, and so there's a lot of research and thought that went into that, and it kind of seemed like I was losing the direction. And then I realized, well, we can approximate. It doesn't have to be perfect. We can match colors as best we can and just kind of go from there. So it was definitely a failure along the way. On top of that, I actually initially thought this was something I could create on my own. I'm not very tech savvy, so I got the suggestion, check out something like Game Salad, where it's really user-friendly and you can create things as you go. And they were very nice, and they answered all of my questions. But then just more questions came up, and I realized it's just not my language. It's just not. So I was taking more time asking the questions and learning the language of coding than actually creating the app itself and working on the project itself. And so it was really, one step forward, two steps back. And finally, I just said, it's not me. I'm not a programmer. I'm not an app designer. I'm a creator of projects, but I can't be that hands-on. And so I had to give up. I had to say, all right, it's time to call somebody else in because it's not happening.
And what would you say is, like, let's begin with your first story. What would you say is something that you learned? What would you approach differently? Of course, you'll never be exactly in the same situation, but maybe there are things that you can generalize or from that experience that you would say, well, if I had this kind of situation in the future, my approach would be different, or the way I start things would be different. I don't know, what changed from that time to now that you feel would perhaps having that approach initially change that failure into a success?
So I think the biggest lesson I learned is you need to start with an idea that you intend to finish with. So if I had begun the project with an app in mind, with technology in mind, my approach would have been different from the beginning. But because I started it as an artistic endeavor, it was a loss of translation in the execution. So as I continue to learn and as I continue to approach my next project, I think if you can bear in mind what your end goal is from the beginning, it makes it a lot easier each step of the way.
So it's not just about seeing what are exactly every step that you're going to take, but actually having an idea of where you want to reach. Like, what's your end game, your end project? Where are you aiming at? Because if you don't know where you want to get to, it's hard to get there, right?
Exactly. And you need a roadmap, and you can't make a map to an unknown destination. It's simply not possible. So I think next time I'll spend a little more time on where am I going as opposed to let's see if I can do it, which is what my approach was at the beginning. I just wanted to see if I could.
There you go. And on the other one, I'm guessing I have a few guesses of what was your main learning, but what would you say about the second story about when you started learning how to program and so on? What would you change, or what would be your different approach?
I think it's important to be honest about who you are. And I'm definitely a literary artistic person. And even though I like the idea of learning different communications in the computer world, it's just not me. So even though I wanted to, I think I could have been honest with myself and saved myself some months of work and just admit that you need help. Like it's not for you. Just ask for help. That's okay.
Absolutely. So reaching out for help makes a lot of sense. And the other thing that I would say is, it doesn't mean that you cannot learn to program. It just means that for your current situation and what you were expecting and the timelines you had defined, it was maybe not the moment or not the project to focus on for learning how to program. I mean, you can still learn how to program. Nobody can say no to that, but maybe it was not the right time, or maybe you just didn't want to focus on learning that thing, which could have been like a hobby or a side thing that you had. Or you could just ditch it and say, you know what, I don't want to learn this. This is just not my thing. But again, realizing that from the get-go, what's your passion, where you at, and where your abilities and so on, I think is very, very important as well.
Oh, definitely. If I would have gone into it with the goal, I'm going to learn how to program, I would have been much more relaxed about it and probably enjoyed the process and gotten good at it. But my goal was...
And successful. I mean, you did learn how to program to a certain capacity for sure.
Right. But my goal was, I want to get this app made, and built into that goal, because there isn't another app like it, I had to explain over and over what I was attempting to do. So there was so many pockets of information that had to be communicated. The programming was just lost in that. So I think if I were to sit down with another mindset, like you said, a little more goal oriented, it wouldn't have been as frustrating.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing it has to do with this story as well. But would you say that there is, a story that you can tell us related to actually some challenge that you had, that you set forth to overcoming, and you said, well, this is what I'm going to do. And how did you solve it using, again, your creative capacity, your abilities, maybe something related to games? Do you have such a story?
I definitely think we all hit roadblocks, and it's a matter of what you do in those moments. For me, mine was finances. When I realized I'm not going to be able to do this myself the way I want it done, everybody quoted me things that weren't feasible at the time. I am a mom. I do have other expenses to consider. And then somebody kind of said, hey, there's this freelancer site where you can go on and you can just describe your project, and people bid on it, and you communicate with different people and see who fits your project and go from there. And so it was a fabulous resource. And I found somebody within my budget who was just as excited about the project as I was. And that's what I was looking for. I don't want somebody who's just going to do the job. I want somebody who thinks it's an interesting job, because then they're invested in more than one way, and they're going to be more apt to open their creative mind as well. So he and I, like I said, exchanged emails over significantly different time zones. And it was great because he had never done a project like that before either. And so he considered himself to be a certain kind of program designer, app writer, game maker, whatever you want to say. And by the end of it, he said, I think I'm going to branch out and do more of these projects. So it was a learning experience for both of us, which was just fantastic.
Absolutely. That sounds great and engages. What I would like you to focus on as well from an experience like this one is that you don't have, the first thing is, of course, as we said before, you don't have to do absolutely everything. Sometimes it makes more sense than others to, incorporate people into your project and so on. And that is a possibility, and you don't have to know everything that's going on in every single project at every single point. If you're going into gamification, if you're creating game-based solutions, You don't have necessarily to know programming. I mean, it can be useful. Maybe you can do it yourself. Maybe not. Maybe you don't know some things about design, visual design, and it's okay. I mean, you can search out. You can go to this place, and I'm going to ask you, Jennifer, if you can tell us what was that web page that you went to, because maybe there's some engagers looking exactly for that right now.
It's called Freelancer, and it's a very simple concept. You just pitch your idea, and you set your budget, and you wait. And then you get people from all around the world, and you get a look at their experience, at their past ratings, so you know that they're capable of doing the project. And it allows you to communicate back and forth about the details and work it out yourselves. So it's a great way to connect people who are looking for freelance jobs and people who are looking for someone to help with their project. It was really useful.
So freelancer.com, I'm guessing, something like that, right?
Yeah, I think it's an app even, so you could just Google it and it'll pop right up.
Cool. That sounds great. So engagers, again, think about these things. Sometimes I'm guessing that from that, one of the difficult things could be how to decide what your budget is. But, there's always limitations, and sometimes it's just whatever you have available, and you test it out and see if somebody comes up that fits your profile. If not, maybe you want to scope or rescope the level of your project and see if that fits your budget. There's many things you could do. We could go into the deep end of project scoping and project management. That's definitely not the focus of today. But what I mean is, I think there are many tools, there are many ways in which we can take steps forward, and this is definitely one of them. You are not alone out there. There's many people who you can, sort of consult with. You can ask. You have the resource of here. You have Professor Game podcast where you can listen to experts. You have people with experience. You can even, subscribe to my email list and maybe reply to one of the emails and make a specific question, and I can, lend a helping hand every now and then when I have the chance. I mean, the idea is, again, that you reach out. You lose nothing by trying. We've had by now 100 and something guests that have been offering very generously their emails, their Twitter handles, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Reach out. I mean, reaching out, the worst thing that they can say is no, but that was already guaranteed before asking. So go, once again, reach out and find other people who can be interested and who can help you in your project. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's @RobAlvarezB and hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. And Jennifer, what would you say is something, that would be like a best practice when you approach these types of projects? Probably from your experience, from what you've done, both in the creative world and now in the app world and in this game. Would you say that there was a conclusion that you draw from that could be like a best practice? Like, well, don't forget to do or to apply these kinds of things, and your project is almost always going to be a lot better thanks to that.
I think most importantly, you need to be open-minded to an idea that maybe hadn't occurred to you from the beginning, because you are going to hit roadblocks. There's always going to be something that comes up unexpectedly. And if you stay so focused on, well, this was my original idea, it has to be like this, you're just going to dig your feet in the sand and you're not going to go anywhere. And I could have very easily been stuck if I would have had that mindset. But when you take a minute and consider your other options, when you kind of think outside of the box as far as your expectations go, you're more apt at the end of it to have a project that you're proud of and that you feel is successful, even if it's not exactly what you had in mind.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm a computer engineer, so I do some of the terminology as well. So one of the things, and of course, definitely in game design as well, the term for that would definitely, and entrepreneurship, is iteration. So you don't have to obsess over some things. I mean, definitely you do have to have a vision. You have to make sure you have an objective that is clear, but be clear on the objective, be clear on what problem you want to solve, be clear on your audience. Who are you reaching out to? Which even that could change as well. But be very clear on those things. But that doesn't mean you can't iterate on almost everything else. I mean, the way in which you solve a problem might not be the best one. And if you find a better one, or you find out your way is just not even working, well, you're out there to solve that problem, not to use your solution for that problem. So iterate, and that's fine. I mean, we talked about it recently in the anniversary episode. One of the main steps when creating a gamified solution is iteration. You start, very basic and with a few steps that you have, so that you reach something that you can test out, that you can play test, and then you can iterate based on that feedback that you received and see what worked, what didn't, and gather that feedback, which is absolutely crucial for any project that you could be thinking. So thank you very much for that best practice. It makes a lot of sense, Jennifer. And given what you have heard up until now, because I know you did have a chance to listen to a few interviews before we connected, and what you've been hearing from these questions, is there anybody that comes to your mind, Jennifer, that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
So I found it very interesting and I cannot recall his name and I apologize, but he was a professor and he designed games. And I believe he's one of the head designers of a gaming company. He was on, I want to say 4 or 5 podcasts ago.
Okay.
I'd have to look. But what I found, I know that's not super helpful and I should have written down his name. What I found interesting was he was looking at it from 2 perspectives. One, from let me create and design a game, and 2, how do you teach those ideas? And I thought that was incredibly challenging because it's 2 separate mind frames, but he seemed to be able to communicate well in both areas. So I feel so bad I don't remember his name. I could look.
But did that pop to your mind somebody else that maybe you would like to also listen to, like that you haven't heard before, or that just came to your mind, like, this person would maybe make a lot of sense there, or maybe not. I mean, you can say, well, that was a person that made a lot of sense to me, or maybe somebody you've met, I don't know, like a book you've read or something. Is there anybody that comes to your mind for that?
So this is going to sound a little left field, but hear me out. I really enjoy reading Malcolm Gladwell. Have you heard of him?
I think so.
So what's interesting is he does a lot of research about how we think and how society works. And he's written some amazing books. But what I think really relates to this is he talks about how we learn. So the way we develop language skills, the way we look at things. And I would love to hear his ideas on gaming, on technology, because I think when you're already studying how the the mind forms, especially when we're children, and how we learn language, I feel like the way kids are learning now is completely different because of games and apps and technology.
Interesting. So Malcolm Gladwell, is that correct?
Yes, he's a well-known author, maybe more in the States, but it's all about how we think and how we work. And that's what gaming is based on, is how we think and how we respond and how we get to the next place.
Seems like he is Canadian as I'm Googling it right now.
Oh, good.
Malcolm Timothy
Okay.
Gladwell, yeah. Canadian journalist, author, and public speaker. We'll check that out and see what we can get out of Malcolm if we have a chance to chat with him. And you mentioned that he's written books as well. And I would like to know if you would have any recommendation as far as a book that you would recommend to this audience, to the engagers. So
one of my favorites of his is called The Tipping Point. And it's a well-known expression, but basically what happens in that moment of shift, that moment of change. And I think that relates really well to the gaming mindset, because there has to be a moment, a shift.
Fantastic. That sounds great. And of course, we can't let you go without a question like this one, which everybody in this podcast has to answer. And it is about, which is your favorite game?
I am old school. I remember back when it was just Atari, and that may age me a bit. So I began my exploration of games in a very, very simplistic way. And even though there's amazing, amazing advancement, there's a part of me that still goes back to that black console. And they make them now where you can just plug it into your TV and you can play any game ever made on Atari.
Yep.
It's just, yes. And I don't know, it brings me back to being a kid. It reminds me of that first sense of wonder back when, it was such this crazy new idea that you could play these kind of games in your house, and you could beat it. And that was it was revolutionary.
Absolutely. And I want to point out here, engagers, when you hear Jennifer here saying these things, you can feel, that engagement that she has, all that motivation. And if you think about it, it is definitely a gamification technique as well, where you're using that sort of, there's many different theories on which game mechanic that is called, but more than the name that we want to call it, it's about nostalgia and how that relates and that brings you back to some social experience that you had. And social, it doesn't necessarily mean with other human beings, but that interaction that you had with that game, it brings you back and you have that experience within you that gets you excited. So that's what I mean by that. And it is a very, very powerful strategy for many, many cases. As you've probably seen in the gaming world, as she was mentioning, there's many things about nostalgia, like bringing us back to those early games for people like probably around my age, older or younger as well, who played those initial games, video games, and get that feeling of what you like, remember what you felt back in the day when you were playing these for the first time. And that is a very, very powerful thing. I mean, we had recently, well, maybe not so recently, Daniel Silmanovich of the Arcade Hotel, and he was telling us how some parents come to the hotel and they're playing these very, very old consoles with their very young kids and saying, like, back in the day, this is what we played, and, having that adventure with their young kids, discovering how these games were played back then. So I'm guessing that we are running out of time by now, Jennifer. So I don't want to let you go before you tell us, like, where can we find you in the world of the internet or similar? How can we connect with you? And of course, if you have any final piece of advice or anything else that you want to leave us with.
So I did want to touch on what you just said about nostalgia, because that is exactly the idea that I built my app around. So instead of randomly assigning each letter a color, I chose each both based on both associations and well-held ideas. So to give one example, the letter A is represented by red, because when you're a kid, the first flashcard they ever show you is A is for apple, and it's that bright red apple. And that's the first thing you think of when you're learning to read. And so I wanted to build all the associations on something that you could understand so you could really learn it. So I'm so glad you said that, because I really think that's how our minds work and that's how we connect to something. And it tied in perfectly. I had to bring it up.
There you go.
So basically, check out the App Store. One little click. The app's called Paint to Me. If you want to look into my book, it's on Amazon. You can find me on Facebook, Donuts and Dandelions. It's a very rare name. There's only one. It's just me. It'll be very, very clear. It's me. And if you do have any questions, paint to me at Gmail. That's me. Again, there's just one. It's only me. You're not going to get lost. So send me any questions you have or any ideas. And I really hope that people engage with this as a new way to communicate with their friends and a new way to discover how we look at art and how we think about language.
There you go. Very exciting. We have all the details of Jennifer now. However, for now and for today, Engagers, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you around, because this podcast only makes sense with you. And I hope you enjoyed this interview with Jennifer. This was a different episode, and we like to have that every now and then as well. Do you have questions that you would also like to ask to future other guests? All you have to do is go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. If it is selected, it will come up in a future episode and you will get your answer. Before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know how Scott Crabtree went from video games to board games? Well, then all you have to do is subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.